When Judge Elijah Monroe, a respected black judge, is wrongfully detained during a routine traffic stop, the encounter exposes the deep-seated racism in America. Despite his calm demeanor and clear credentials, Elijah faces humiliation, suspicion, and systemic prejudice at the hands of an arrogant officer determined to assert control. What begins as a routine stop spirals into an infuriating display of bias and abuse of power, forcing Elijah to confront not only the injustice he faces, but the larger systems that enable it. His story becomes a fight for dignity, truth, and accountability in a world reluctant to change. The mid-morning sun spilled golden streaks onto the cracked pavement outside Thompson's Diner. The small-town staple sat at the corner of Market and Pine, its red and white awning frayed at the edges, its neon open sign flickering against the grime-streaked window. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burnt coffee, sizzling bacon, and the faint tang of bleach. Everything you'd expect in a place where folks stopped for no-nonsense meals and familiar faces. Elijah Monroe slipped into a corner booth unnoticed. He didn't mind. He had perfected the art of blending in. Dressed in pressed dark slacks, a soft navy sweater over a white button-up shirt, and a pair of worn brown loafers, Elijah looked like any man his age. Mid-50s, distinguished, but unassuming. His salt-and-pepper beard was neatly trimmed, framing strong features and deep-set eyes that often held more than they revealed. Elijah's morning routine rarely changed after a 6 a.m. Jog along the empty streets of Clarksfield, a town tucked away in Georgia's forgotten pockets. He liked to stop at Thompson's for breakfast. 2 eggs scrambled, turkey sausage, whole wheat toast. Predictable, just the way he liked it. Today, however, Thompson's wasn't quiet. A handful of workers from the county sanitation department huddled near the bar, swapping jokes loud enough to bounce off the old vinyl booths. Near the back, 2 women gossiped in hushed tones, their voices carrying anyway. Elijah turned his attention to his phone, scanning an article on judicial reform, more courts under scrutiny for sentencing disparities. He sighed softly, the headline a reminder of the world he worked tirelessly to balance. A world where justice didn't always mean fairness, where the color of a person's skin sometimes weighed heavier than the crime committed. "Morning, Judge Monroe." Elijah looked up to see Sally, the diner's longtime waitress, a warm smile creasing her face as she approached with a steaming mug of black coffee. "Thought you'd snuck in without me noticing." "Good morning, Sally," Elijah replied, his voice smooth and steady. He glanced up at her kindly. "You know I wouldn't dare." Sally laughed as she set the coffee down. She was in her late 60s, her hair dyed a shade too bright, but her no-nonsense attitude had earned her the respect of every regular who walked through the door. "You're too quiet. That's your problem. A man your size ought to make some noise once in a while." "I'll try harder next time," Elijah said, smirking faintly as he took a sip. "You better eggs and toast?" "Turkey sausage too, please." Sally winked. "Coming right up." Elijah leaned back in his booth, enjoying the first few moments of peace as the chatter in the diner carried on. His life didn't allow for much stillness. As chief judge of the Clarksfield County Circuit Court, Elijah Monroe held one of the most powerful positions in the state's judicial system. With 25 years on the bench, he had earned a reputation for fairness and wisdom, though his rulings had made him more than a few enemies in powerful places. But here, in Thompson's Diner, none of that mattered. No black robes, no courtroom decorum, just another man looking to enjoy his breakfast. And truth be told, that was how Elijah liked it. He never cared for the grandiosity that accompanied his position, never cared to remind people who he was or what he'd accomplished. It wasn't humility so much as exhaustion. The world didn't need more reminders of titles. It needed reminders of humanity. From the corner of his eye, Elijah noticed 3 young men enter the diner, their sneakers squeaking against the tile floor. They looked to be in their early 20s, dressed in jeans and oversized hoodies. One of them, tall, wiry, with dreadlocks pulled into a loose ponytail, caught Elijah's eye. For a split second, the young man hesitated, recognition flickering across his face before disappearing. Elijah gave a small nod. He didn't know the boy's name, but he knew his face. The young man had been in his courtroom 6 months ago, charged with trespassing and vandalism. Elijah had gone against the district attorney's recommendation, issuing community service and probation instead of jail time. "Your Honor," the young man murmured, dipping his head slightly as they passed Elijah's booth. Elijah's lips curled faintly in acknowledgement. He didn't expect gratitude for his decisions, just a chance for people to do better. The young men made their way toward the back of the diner, their hushed conversation blending into the hum of the room. Elijah returned to his coffee, determined to keep his peace. But moments later, the sharp clink of dishes and a raised voice pulled his attention back up. "What do you think you're doing?" The voice came from the bar. A man in his late 40s, wearing a county worker's uniform, stood with his arms crossed tightly across his chest, his face flushed with irritation. He was glaring at the 3 young men, who had just taken their seats. "We're here to eat," one of the boys replied calmly, though his voice held an edge of defensiveness. "You think this is that kind of place?" the man barked, his tone loaded with meaning. "Take a look around. You're not welcome here." Elijah's jaw tightened, his fingers curling around the mug as he observed the exchange. The other patrons had grown quiet, their gazes flickering nervously toward the bar. Sally stood frozen, the plate of Elijah's breakfast halfway to his table. "Harold, stop that," she snapped, her voice sharp as a whip. "This ain't your business." "It is my business when people like them come in here acting like they own the place," Harold shot back, his eyes narrowing. The diner fell into an uneasy silence. Elijah could feel the weight of every unspoken word lingering in the air, a tension so thick it seemed to press against his chest. People like them, the 3 young men sat stiffly in their seats, their faces carefully blank, though Elijah could see the anger simmering behind their eyes. The young man with dreadlocks, the one who had recognized Elijah, opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Elijah had seen this scenario play out too many times before, in countless places and countless ways. He'd seen it in his courtroom when a black teenager faced harsher sentencing than his white counterpart for the same crime. He'd seen it in boardrooms when assumptions about competence were drawn based on appearance alone. He'd seen it in his own life, even now. People like them. Sally broke the silence. "They're customers, Harold. Same as you. Sit down and mind your food before I throw you out myself." Harold muttered under his breath but backed down, shaking his head as he stomped back toward his seat. Sally shot the boys an apologetic look before hurrying Elijah's breakfast over to him, her hands trembling slightly as she set the plate down. "Sorry about that, Judge," she said quietly. Elijah shook his head, his voice calm but low. "You don't owe me an apology, Sally." She paused for half a beat, looking like she wanted to say more, but instead, she offered a faint smile and bustled back toward the kitchen. Elijah took a bite of his toast, though his appetite had waned. He could hear Harold still grumbling at the bar, low enough to stay out of earshot, but loud enough to make his point. The 3 young men sat silently in the back, their shoulders tense, eyes glued to the tabletop. For a moment, Elijah debated letting it go, staying in his booth, finishing his breakfast, leaving the fight for another day. But something about the way the boy had looked at him, the silent recognition in his eyes, pulled at Elijah. He placed his fork down, straightened his shoulders, and stood. The diner fell silent once again as Judge Elijah Monroe, unassuming and unnoticed no more, began to walk toward the bar. The diner's silence deepened as Elijah Monroe made his way across the room. It wasn't loud, just the soft shuffle of well-worn loafers against tile. but every eye followed his deliberate steps. Harold paused mid-sip of his coffee, his gaze narrowing at the figure approaching him. The three young men at the back table shifted uneasily in their seats, watching the scene unfold. Elijah stopped a few feet from Harold's stool at the counter. He wasn't a physically imposing man, but there was a quiet power in the way he stood. Straight-backed, hands resting easily at his sides. "Excuse me," Elijah said, his voice calm but resonant. "I couldn't help but overhear your earlier comment." Harold turned, his mouth tugging into a smirk. "Oh yeah, what's it to you?" Elijah's expression didn't falter. "Those young men came here to eat. You made it very clear they're not welcome. I'm asking you to explain why." A flicker of surprise passed across Harold's face, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. "Don't get all high and mighty, you don't know me." "You're right," Elijah replied smoothly. "I don't, but I know what I heard, and I know the weight of words like yours." The murmur of conversation had completely died now. Even the sanitation workers at the other end of the bar had fallen silent, their earlier laughter forgotten. Harold scoffed and gestured loosely toward the back table. "Look, I call it like I see it. Kids like that come in here, hoodies up, pants sagging, acting like they own the place. Makes people nervous, you know? It's not a crime to say what everyone else is thinking." Elijah's jaw tightened, though his expression remained composed. He glanced back at the young men, 3 sets of dark, wary eyes watching every move, and then returned his gaze to Harold. "Kids like that," Elijah repeated softly. "You don't know them either, do you? But you've already decided who they are." Harold shrugged, clearly emboldened by the growing attention. "I don't need to know them, I know the type." The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Elijah felt it, the anger creeping up his spine, the sharp sting of familiarity. He had heard the type his entire life, thrown like a knife at people who looked like him. It was a phrase that dismissed humanity, replacing it with something small and threatening. He took a deep breath, the calm mask slipping briefly to reveal a glint of steel behind his dark eyes. "Harold," Elijah said, his voice measured but colder now. "I've spent decades in courtrooms. I've seen every type you can imagine. Criminals, victims, witnesses, families torn apart. And do you know what I've learned?" Harold didn't answer, but his smirk faltered. "You can't judge a man by how he looks, what he wears, or where he comes from," Elijah continued. "Character isn't written on a person's skin or stitched into their clothes, but prejudice is written in how you treat them." The room felt frozen, the weight of Elijah's words settling over every corner. Harold snorted, a weak attempt to break the tension. "Prejudice. I'm just speaking the truth." Elijah's gaze didn't waver. "The truth? Or just what you've chosen to believe?" Before Harold could answer, the bell above the diner door jingled, breaking the stillness. 2 police officers stepped inside, their presence shifting the atmosphere from tense to brittle. The taller of the two, Officer Frank Sullivan, surveyed the room with practiced detachment, his pale blue eyes settling on the table of young men in the back. "Well, well," Sullivan said, his voice a drawl edged with authority. "I got a call about some disturbance over here. What's going on?" Elijah turned slightly, already anticipating where this was going. Harold gestured toward the young men with a smug grin. "I told you these kids were trouble. I didn't want to wait for them to start anything." The young man with dreadlocks tensed visibly in his seat. "We didn't do anything." Officer Sullivan's partner, a younger officer with a buzz cut, rested a hand on his holstered taser as he stepped toward the table. "Let's keep it down, boys. You mind standing up?" "They haven't broken any laws," Elijah interjected, his voice clear. Both officers paused, their attention shifting to him. Sullivan frowned, clearly sizing Elijah up for the first time. "Who are you exactly?" Elijah met his gaze steadily. Elijah Monroe. The name meant nothing to them. He could tell Sullivan's dismissive tone confirmed it. Well, Mr. Monroe, we're just doing our jobs here. These boys look like they're up to something, and we're going to make sure everything's in order. They're having breakfast, Elijah replied, his voice cooling. Sitting quietly, I'd say the only disturbance here is your presence. Is that so? Sullivan's tone hardened. Why don't you let us handle it? The second officer moved closer to the young men. IDs, all of you now. One of the boys, smaller than the others, stammered nervously. We didn't bring them. We just came to eat. The young man with dreadlocks shook his head and muttered, This is bull. Enough, Sullivan snapped, his hand hovering near his radio. I suggest you cooperate unless you want this to get worse. Elijah took a step forward, placing himself between the officers and the table. The room seemed to shrink, all focus drawn to the man who now stood as a shield. That won't be necessary, Elijah said firmly. You're harassing them based on assumptions they haven't done anything wrong. Sullivan's gaze darkened. You interfering with police work, sir? No, I'm reminding you of their rights, Elijah replied, unflinching. You're treating them like criminals, but there's no cause. Sullivan sneered. And who are you to tell us how to do our jobs? Elijah straightened, his full height adding to his calm authority. Chief Judge Elijah Monroe, Clarksfield County Circuit Court. The diner seemed to inhale sharply. Sullivan's face froze, confusion and realization flickering in his eyes. The younger officer faltered, his hand dropping from his belt. Harold's mouth fell open slightly, his earlier bravado evaporating. You're a judge? Sullivan finally asked, though his tone still carried an edge of disbelief. I am, Elijah confirmed, his voice cutting clean through the moment. And I suggest you let these young men finish their meal in peace. Sullivan's mouth opened and closed, his face reddening. He shifted uncomfortably on his feet, clearly weighing his next move. Fine, he muttered at last, jerking his head toward the door. We're leaving. The younger officer followed suit, though his expression remained sheepish. Sullivan shot one last glare at Elijah before storming out, the bell above the door jingling angrily in his wake. For a moment, the diner remained silent. Then slowly, the tension began to dissolve. Elijah turned to the young men, his voice softening. You're all right now, go ahead and eat. The young man with dreadlocks nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. Thank you, sir. Elijah inclined his head slightly before turning back toward his booth. As he passed Harold, the man stared down at his coffee, silent and small. Elijah said nothing, though a quiet storm still raged behind his calm exterior. When he finally sat down, his breakfast was cold. Sally approached hesitantly, refilling his coffee with a shaky hand. Judge Monroe, she murmured. I'm sorry about all that. Elijah looked up at her, his gaze soft but steady. You have nothing to apologize for, Sally. She nodded quickly, her lips pressed tight. Elijah picked up his fork, though he found no appetite. His mind replayed the scene, the familiar ache settling deep in his chest. It never changed. People like Harold. Officers like Sullivan. The assumptions, the fear, the anger. No matter how far he'd come, no matter the power of his title, some people only saw the type. As Elijah set his fork down, he glanced out the window beyond the diner. The streets of Clarksfield stretched under the late morning sun, quiet, indifferent, waiting for what would come next. So was Elijah. The rest of the day moved like a slow current, but the unease from the diner followed Elijah like a shadow. Even hours later, as he sat behind his imposing mahogany desk in his chambers, the confrontation replayed in his mind. The smirks, the assumptions. The officer's dismissal of his identity until it became convenient to back down. His assistant, Janine, a sharp and no-nonsense woman in her 40s, knocked softly before stepping inside. "Judge Monroe, your 4:30 meeting with the district attorney's office is about to start." Elijah looked up from the notes he'd been scribbling, his face a carefully neutral mask. "Thank you, Janine. I'll be right there." Janine hesitated, her brows pinching together. "You seem distracted. Is everything all right?" Elijah offered her a small, measured smile. "Just thinking, nothing to worry about." She lingered for a moment longer, but nodded and closed the door behind her. Elijah leaned back in his chair, exhaling a slow breath. He wasn't distracted. He was furious. Not the kind of hot rage that explodes and burns out, but the cold, simmering kind that sits heavy in your gut. After all these years, it still happened. The color of his skin could erase decades of hard-earned respect, replacing it with assumptions of guilt, of the type. He had spent his career navigating a system built to deny him, built to deny people like the boys in the diner, and now, with every passing moment, it was becoming harder to hold his tongue. Later that evening, Elijah drove toward his home in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town. The sky had faded to muted hues of lavender and deep blue as streetlights blinked to life. His mind was elsewhere, replaying plans for an upcoming ruling, until he noticed the flashing blue and red lights in his rearview mirror. A tightness gripped his chest. He flicked his blinker, pulling his car to the shoulder. He sat still, his hands resting calmly on the steering wheel. This was not new, not unexpected, yet it never felt less insulting. A flashlight beam bounced through the window, and a voice barked behind the glare. "Roll down the window license and registration." Elijah complied, moving deliberately. "Officer, is there a reason I'm being pulled over?" he asked, his voice even. "Your taillight's out," came the gruff response. Elijah's brows furrowed. He knew for a fact his taillights were fine. "That's strange. I check my vehicle regularly." The flashlight dropped slightly, revealing the officer's face. It was him, Officer Frank Sullivan, from the diner earlier that day. His expression was taut with something between smugness and contempt. "You again," Elijah said, his voice sharp but controlled. Sullivan smirked faintly. "Small town, Judge Monroe, imagine that." Another patrol car pulled up behind Sullivan's, and a second officer stepped out, one Elijah didn't recognize. This was escalating. Elijah's heartbeat remained steady, but he felt the slow churn of indignation rising again. "Step out of the car," Sullivan ordered, his hand resting near his holstered gun. Elijah's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Is that really necessary?" "It is," Sullivan said, his tone like a blade. Elijah knew how this worked. The quiet storm simmering beneath Sullivan's surface wasn't about a taillight. It was about bruised pride. The diner encounter had exposed him, stripped away the comfortable armor of his authority. Now Sullivan was reaching for any excuse to assert his dominance. Elijah complied, his movements deliberate as he stepped onto the roadside gravel. The night air was cool against his face, but his skin prickled under the weight of Sullivan's gaze. "Hands on the hood," Sullivan said, circling him like a predator. Elijah didn't move. "Officer Sullivan, I hope you realize how far you're stepping out of line. My rights are clear, and I will not—" "Now," Sullivan snapped, closing the gap between them. The second officer looked uneasy, glancing between Sullivan and Elijah. "Frank, we don't need to—" "Quiet, rookie." Elijah turned his gaze toward Sullivan, calm but sharp. "This is harassment, officer. You're making a mistake." Sullivan's eyes darkened. "A mistake? You don't get to tell me what mistakes look like. I'm the law here." There it is. The unspoken truth slipped into plain sight. Sullivan didn't care that Elijah was a judge. He only saw a man who challenged him, who didn't know his place. Sullivan took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. Men like you think you're untouchable, huh? Think you can talk your way out of anything? Well, not this time. Is that what you think I am? Elijah replied softly. The quiet authority in his tone made Sullivan's expression flicker with something ugly. You're resisting, Sullivan barked suddenly. He grabbed Elijah's arm roughly, twisting it toward the car hood. The second officer flinched. Sullivan, don't! Stay out of it! Elijah stumbled slightly under Sullivan's grip but didn't struggle. His heart was pounding, but his face remained composed. The distant hum of traffic on the highway seemed deafening now, the flashing lights painting the moment in streaks of red and blue. As Elijah sat in the holding cell hours later, he leaned back against the cold, concrete wall, his arms folded across his chest. The cuffs were long gone, but their ghostly bite lingered around his wrists. He glanced at the other side of the bars, where Sullivan sat at a desk, filing paperwork with exaggerated, deliberate movements. The whole ordeal had been as petty as it was predictable. He hadn't been charged yet. There was nothing to charge him with. But Sullivan's game was clear. Keep him here long enough to humiliate him, long enough to send a message. Elijah's mind was a storm beneath his quiet surface. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been cornered, silenced, or abused by those in power. The boys from the diner flashed through his thoughts. How many times had they faced something like this? How many others had no voice, no title to shield them? Judge Monroe. A new voice interrupted his thoughts. Elijah looked up to see Mitchell Graves, an old friend and one of the most respected defense attorneys in the state. Mitchell's tall frame filled the hallway, his gray suit impeccable even at midnight. Mitchell, Elijah said quietly, pushing himself off the wall. Mitchell's gaze burned toward Sullivan, who had the decency to look uncomfortable. Release him now. Sullivan shifted, his arrogance slipping. He was resisting. Mitchell cut him off, his voice low and furious. A judge in your holding cell over a broken taillight. Do you want to see how that plays on every news outlet in Georgia? Because I will make sure it does. Sullivan scowled, but said nothing. A minute later, the cell door buzzed open. Elijah stepped through, his back straight, his expression unshaken. Let's get you out of here, Mitchell muttered, his hand briefly resting on Elijah's shoulder. In the parking lot, the night air felt fresh, though it did little to wash away the day's events. Mitchell turned to Elijah as they approached his car. You're going to file a complaint, right? Elijah looked at him, his gaze steady. No. Mitchell blinked. What do you mean no Sullivan can't get away with this? You know that. Elijah exhaled slowly. He won't get away with it, but a complaint is a ripple I'm going to make waves. Mitchell's brow furrowed. What are you planning? Elijah's eyes turned toward the horizon, where the faintest sliver of dawn had begun to rise. The fire in his gaze burned brighter now. It's time I stop playing quiet, Elijah said softly. This isn't just about me. This is about a system that lets men like Sullivan believe they can do whatever they want, that ends now. Mitchell stared at him, a mixture of admiration and concern. Elijah, you're taking on a storm. Elijah's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. Then, I'll stand in the rain. The courthouse was quieter than usual, the kind of stillness that preceded something big. A verdict, a scandal, or a storm that no one could stop. Elijah Monroe moved through its halls with his usual measured calm, but there was something different in the air. A shift, a hum of anticipation. Janine met him just outside his chambers, her face a portrait of barely contained concern. Judge Monroe, the press is here again. They're asking questions about the incident from last night. Elijah stopped, his shoulders squared but his expression unreadable. Which outlet? All of them, Janine said, lowering her voice. Local news, statewide reporters. Heck, I think I even saw someone from Atlanta's major affiliates. Of course they were here. The story had already begun to leak, the pieces falling into place like a puzzle no one wanted to see. A judge detained overnight. Unlawful stop misconduct allegations. The details were still rumors, but rumors had a way of spreading like wildfire, especially in a small town. Let them wait, Elijah said calmly. I have a docket to clear. Judge Monroe. He cut her off with a look, though his voice remained kind. Janine, trust me. She hesitated, then nodded, her lips pressed into a tight line. Yes, sir. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Elijah entered, his black robe settling heavily around his shoulders. People turned, their gazes lingering longer than usual, no longer subtle as they murmured theories to one another. Even his court clerks exchanged uneasy glances before refocusing on their tasks. Elijah took his seat at the bench and surveyed the room. Attorneys shuffled their papers nervously. Defendants avoided his gaze. The weight of Sullivan's petty, calculated humiliation clung to him like smoke, lingering where it wasn't wanted. He knew that for many, his overnight detainment was confirmation of something, a stain. Proof of all the assumptions people were too polite to say aloud. He straightened his back, refusing to shrink beneath the eyes. Call the first case. The morning proceeded, but the unease never left. By midday recess, Elijah stood in his chambers staring at the phone. Mitchell's voice from the night before echoed in his head. You're taking on a storm. And he was. But storms didn't scare Elijah Monroe. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Mitchell arrived at Elijah's office that evening, looking exhausted, but sharp as always. You've got people talking, Elijah, he said as he dropped into the chair opposite Elijah's desk. The media's sniffing for blood, and you've got Sullivan doubling down on his version of events. Elijah's jaw tightened slightly. What's he saying? That you resisted, that you were combative. He's already covering his tracks, making it look like he was justified. Mitchell sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. Elijah, this could get ugly. You know how these stories go. If they twist it, if they make you the aggressor, it'll be open season. I know. Mitchell frowned, leaning forward. So what's the plan? You called me for a reason. Elijah looked out the window at the city below, the courthouse looming dark and imposing against the fading light. It's time to go public. Mitchell blinked. Public, Elijah? Are you sure once you open that door there's no closing it? I'm sure. Elijah turned back to face him. This isn't just about me. What Sullivan did is part of a much bigger problem, a problem people are tired of pretending doesn't exist. Mitchell studied him for a moment, then sighed, leaning back in his chair. If we're going public, we need evidence, witnesses, people willing to speak up. I have both, Elijah said simply. Mitchell raised a brow. You do? I've been collecting accounts of Sullivan's misconduct for months, Elijah replied. There are patterns, consistent overreach, harassment, targeting young black men specifically. People have been too afraid to come forward. But after last night, some of them called me. They're ready to talk. Mitchell's eyes narrowed with understanding. You've been planning this? Elijah gave a faint nod. I've known about him for a while. What happened to me was the spark, but the fire has been there all along. It's time to shine a light on it. The next day, the town erupted. Elijah Monroe's press conference was held in the shadow of the Clarksfield courthouse. Cameras pointed at the steps, as if they might catch history unfolding. Reporters jostled for position, their microphones and recorders outstretched. Elijah stood at the podium, his black suit immaculate, his expression calm but firm. Mitchell stood just behind him, his presence a silent reassurance. Good afternoon, Elijah began, his deep voice carrying through the quiet crowd. My name is Judge Elijah Monroe, and I'm here today not just as a judge, but as a man who has spent his life working within a system that, far too often, fails the people it is supposed to protect. A murmur rolled through the crowd as camera shutters clicked furiously. Elijah continued, unshaken. 2 nights ago, I was stopped and detained without cause. The officer who pulled me over acted on bias, not evidence, and when I spoke up to defend my rights, I was treated as a criminal. He paused, letting the words settle. But this isn't just about what happened to me, Elijah said, his voice rising with quiet intensity. This is about a pattern of behavior. It's about a system that allows certain people to wield power unchecked, to profile and humiliate others because of the color of their skin or where they come from. This cannot stand. The crowd was silent now, holding its collective breath. I will not be silent. Not this time. I have spent my life believing that the law can be a tool for justice, but only if we hold those who abuse it accountable. Elijah looked directly into the cameras, as though speaking to every viewer at home. To those who have been mistreated, who have been silenced, you are not alone. Your voices matter, your lives matter, and I will fight to ensure you are heard. Questions exploded from the crowd as Elijah stepped back from the podium, but Mitchell was already moving to escort him inside. That was a hell of a speech, Mitchell muttered as they passed through the courthouse doors. It wasn't a speech, Elijah replied. It was a promise. The fallout was immediate. News outlets ran the story on repeat. Clarksfield judge accuses local police of systemic misconduct. Sullivan's name was plastered across headlines, though his department quickly went into damage control mode. The sheriff issued a terse statement claiming a full investigation would be conducted, but Elijah knew what that meant. Delay, deflect, deny. But what they hadn't counted on was the people. By evening, a crowd had gathered outside the police station. Protesters carried signs that read, "Justice for all and end profiling." Now local activists took to social media, amplifying Elijah's story alongside others who came forward with their own accounts of mistreatment. At home, Elijah sat on his couch, his laptop open as he scrolled through messages pouring in. Some were hateful. Another race-baiter crying wolf. Others were grateful, hopeful. Thank you for speaking up. My son went through the same thing. His phone buzzed, and Mitchell's name lit up the screen. Have you seen the news? Mitchell's voice crackled through the line, breathless. Sullivan suspended the mayor's calling for an independent review of the entire department. Elijah closed his eyes briefly, his chest rising with a slow breath. It's a start. More than a start, Elijah, Mitchell said. You've struck a nerve. This is going to get bigger. Elijah opened his eyes, his gaze steady as he looked out the window, where the lights of the town twinkled against the darkness. Then we'll see how strong their foundations are. Mitchell was silent for a beat before asking, And what about Sullivan? Elijah's voice was firm. He'll answer for what he's done. The fight was just beginning, but Elijah Monroe was ready. The courthouse steps were bathed in grey light as a cold drizzle fell from the sky, turning the crowd's murmurs into a low hum beneath the sound of raindrops. Reporters lined the walkway, their cameras focused on the entrance as Elijah Monroe climbed the steps, flanked by Mitchell and Janine. It's a circus out here, Mitchell muttered, adjusting the umbrella he held over them. The department must have tipped off every news outlet. They're hoping to turn this into a spectacle, Elijah replied, his voice calm. Let's give them one they won't forget. At the top of the steps, Elijah paused. For the first time, the familiar building, his courthouse, felt foreign, its walls heavy with the weight of the fight he'd brought to its doors. Ready? Mitchell asked. Elijah's answer was firm. I've been ready. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with nervous tension as people filed in. Journalists, community leaders, off-duty officers. The gallery was packed, with even more standing along the back wall. At the front of the room sat Officer Sullivan, his uniform crisp and his posture rigid. Beside him sat his attorney, a sharp-faced man whose reputation for aggressive tactics preceded him. The room stilled as Elijah entered, every eye turning toward him. He didn't flinch beneath their gaze. He had faced rooms like this before, courtrooms where justice was on trial as much as the people within it. But today felt different. Today, he was the one in the spotlight. Sullivan's eyes flicked toward Elijah, and for the first time, Elijah saw something more than arrogance in his gaze. He saw fear. It was faint, well hidden behind the facade of authority, but it was there. Good, Elijah thought. He should be afraid. "Let's proceed," Judge Herrera said, her voice cutting through the quiet. She was a formidable woman, with a no-nonsense demeanor that Elijah had always respected today. He was grateful for her presence. Mitchell rose to his feet, his expression sharp and focused. "Your Honor, we are here today to address a disturbing pattern of harassment and misconduct at the hands of Officer Frank Sullivan, actions which culminated in the unlawful detention of my client, Judge Elijah Monroe." Sullivan's attorney shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. These are baseless accusations meant to undermine my client's character." "Overruled," Judge Herrera said coolly. "Mr. Graves, proceed." Mitchell nodded, his voice cutting like a blade. "Officer Sullivan's actions were not isolated incidents, but part of a systemic abuse of power, one that targeted individuals based on race and assumptions of guilt. We have witnesses ready to testify, evidence to present, and a clear pattern that cannot be ignored." He turned to face Sullivan. "And it starts with you." Sullivan sat stone-faced as the first witness took the stand. A young man Elijah recognized from the diner. His voice trembled at first, but Mitchell's calm presence steadied him. "Tell the court what happened to you," Mitchell prompted. The young man swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the chair. "It was last summer I was walking home from work when Officer Sullivan stopped me. He said I looked suspicious. I wasn't doing anything wrong, but he searched my bag anyway. He wouldn't let me leave until I emptied my pockets on the hood of his car." "Did Officer Sullivan explain why you were stopped?" "No. He just kept saying I fit the description of someone they were looking for. I told him I had just gotten off work, but he didn't care." "Thank you," Mitchell said, his tone steady. "No further questions." Sullivan's attorney stepped forward, his expression predatory. "Tell me, son, what were you wearing that night?" The young man frowned. "A hoodie and jeans." The attorney smirked faintly. "And wouldn't you say that matches the description of a lot of people out there?" Mitchell shot to his feet. "Objection relevant?" "Sustained," Judge Herrera said, her tone sharp. The young man left the stand, his shoulders squared but his expression weary. He exchanged a brief glance with Elijah as he passed, gratitude mixed with shame that he even had to be here. Over the next hour, the testimony painted a damning picture. A small business owner. A teenager stopped on his bike. A father detained outside his own home. Each story was a thread, and together they wove a pattern that couldn't be denied. Sullivan, the untouchable officer, had left a trail of victims in his wake. Finally, Mitchell turned to Elijah. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Judge Elijah Monroe to the stand." The courtroom shifted as Elijah rose to his feet. For the first time in years, he found himself on the other side of the bench. He knew the risks, the scrutiny, the attempts to discredit him. But this was his stand, and he would take it. "Judge Monroe," Mitchell began, "can you describe the events of 2 nights ago?" Elijah met Mitchell's gaze and then turned toward the room, his voice clear and unwavering. "I was driving home when I was stopped by Officer Sullivan. He claimed my taillight was out, which I knew was untrue. Despite my compliance, he escalated the situation and detained me without cause." "Why do you believe you were targeted?" Elijah's gaze swept across the room, lingering on Sullivan for a beat. Because I was a black man driving a nice car in the wrong part of town. A ripple moved through the crowd, but Elijah didn't waver. Did you resist, as Officer Sullivan claims? I did not, Elijah said firmly. I spoke up for myself, and I reminded Officer Sullivan of my rights. That was enough for him to decide I was a problem. Mitchell nodded, his voice low but powerful. And what message does this send, Judge Monroe? Elijah looked toward the gallery, his voice rising. It tells people like me that no matter how hard we work, no matter what we achieve, we are still seen as less than it tells our children that their lives are subject to someone else's assumptions. And it tells officers like Sullivan that they can act without consequences. Sullivan's attorney stood abruptly, his face red. Objection, Your Honor. This is grandstanding. Judge Herrera raised a hand. Overruled. Continue, Judge Monroe. Elijah leaned slightly forward, his tone sharp, but I refuse to accept that I refuse to let this go. Unanswered. Officer Sullivan's actions were not the actions of someone protecting his community. They were the actions of someone who believes himself above the law. And today, we prove he is not. When Elijah stepped down, the courtroom hummed with a new energy, a quiet storm. Sullivan shifted uneasily in his seat, his mask of confidence beginning to crack. The final blow came when Mitchell presented body cam footage obtained through subpoena, footage Sullivan had claimed didn't exist. The video showed Sullivan's interaction with Elijah, grainy but clear. His aggressive tone, the unnecessary force, and most damning of all, his whispered words. Men like you think you're untouchable. The courtroom erupted. As the gavel slammed down to restore order, Elijah watched Sullivan from across the room. The officer's face had gone pale, his attorney whispering furiously in his ear. The weight of the confrontation settled over the room as Elijah returned to his seat. Mitchell leaned in, his voice low. You just tore the roof off, Elijah. He's done. But Elijah wasn't celebrating. Not yet. Because he knew the system, knew how it twisted, how it resisted change. Exposing Sullivan was just one battle in a much larger war. Judge Herrera addressed the room, her voice carrying over the murmurs. This court will reconvene tomorrow to determine next steps, Officer Sullivan. Until further notice, you are suspended from active duty pending review. The decision wasn't final, but it was a start. Elijah rose, the eyes of the gallery following him as he walked to the back of the room. The storm wasn't over, not yet, but Sullivan's armor had cracked, and the first light had broken through. As Elijah stepped into the hallway, Mitchell turned to him. You did it. Elijah shook his head faintly. No, we started it. And as he pushed open the courthouse doors, the crowd outside roared. The air in the police department's community meeting hall was thick with tension. Rows of metal chairs filled the room, occupied by concerned residents, reporters with their cameras at the ready, and an uneasy cluster of local officials. The evening was meant to be an open forum, arranged hastily after days of mounting protests and media pressure. It was billed as a chance for the Clarksfield Police Department to address community concerns. In reality, it was damage control. Elijah Monroe knew exactly why he was here. Not to ask for answers. He knew the truth. He was here to deliver it. At the front of the room, Officer Sullivan sat with an unearned sense of composure, his blue uniform crisp, his polished badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. Beside him, Chief Perkins, an older man whose silence had enabled years of quiet abuse, tapped his fingers nervously against the table. Elijah, Mitchell whispered, standing beside him as they waited at the back of the room. You sure about this? Sullivan's going to fight back hard. He'll throw everything he has to discredit you. Elijah adjusted the cuff of his shirt and exhaled slowly, his calm unshakable. Let him. The truth doesn't need armor. Mitchell nodded reluctantly. Then let's finish this. The meeting started with an uncomfortable stiffness, Chief Perkins cleared his throat and stumbled through a hollow speech about trust, partnership, and working towards solutions. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. No one believed a word of it. The room's collective frustration was palpable, a coiled spring waiting for release. And now, we open the floor to questions, Perkins announced, trying to sound confident. Let's keep this civil. The words had barely left his mouth when hands shot into the air. The first few questions came from nervous community members, asking about vague reforms and promises of oversight. Perkins answered with polished, empty platitudes. Then Elijah rose from his seat. The room quieted. The murmurs stopped. Every eye turned toward him as he stepped to the aisle and walked calmly to the front. Sullivan's smirk faltered as Elijah approached, his tall figure cutting through the tension like a blade. Judge Monroe, Perkins said, his voice betraying his unease. I didn't realize you'd be attending. I wouldn't miss it, Elijah replied, his tone cold but polite. He turned to face the crowd, the cameras, and finally, Officer Sullivan. I have a question for Officer Sullivan. Sullivan's jaw tightened. Go ahead. Elijah stepped closer, unshaken by the daggers Sullivan's eyes were throwing. You've been with this department for years, haven't you? Officer Sullivan, highly decorated, respected. That's correct, Sullivan said, his voice clipped. Elijah tilted his head, his gaze unwavering. Tell me, in all those years, how many stops have you made based on a broken taillight? Sullivan frowned, caught off guard. I don't know plenty, I suppose. Plenty, Elijah repeated softly. And how many of those stops escalated into unlawful detention? Sullivan's glare sharpened. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, Elijah interrupted, his voice firm, rising just enough to cut through Sullivan's attempt at control. I'm stating facts 2 nights ago. You stopped me without cause. You accused me of resisting when I asserted my rights, and you detained me with no evidence. Only your assumptions. The crowd murmured, the weight of Elijah's words settling over the room. Sullivan shifted in his seat, clearly trying to keep his composure. That's not how it happened, Sullivan said tightly, but his voice lacked the confidence it carried before. You were combative. You refused to cooperate. Elijah turned to face the crowd, his voice steady. Is that what he told you? That I was combative? That I was dangerous? He looked back at Sullivan. You claimed my taillight was out, but we both know that wasn't true. What was the real reason you stopped me? Sullivan's lips thinned into a hard line. You're twisting this. I was following protocol. Protocol? Elijah's voice rose, carrying across the room. Is it protocol to stop people based on nothing but your own prejudices? Is it protocol to silence anyone who dares question your authority? I did my job, Sullivan snapped, slamming his fist on the table. The sudden outburst silenced the room. The carefully constructed mask of calm shattered, and for the first time, Sullivan's true nature seeped through. Elijah took a step closer, his eyes locked onto Sullivan's. Your job. Tell me, Officer Sullivan, was it your job to stop that young boy last summer? The one walking home in his work uniform? Was it your job to make him empty his pockets on the hood of your car while people watched? What about the father detained outside his home? Or the business owner who filed a complaint you buried? Sullivan's face paled, his hands gripping the edge of the table. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about, Elijah cut him off, his voice ringing with quiet power. I've spoken to them. I've spoken to the people this department has ignored, harassed, and humiliated. The people who couldn't fight back because they didn't have the power. But you made a mistake when you stopped me. Officer Sullivan. He leaned forward, his voice dropping just enough to make the room hold its breath. You picked the wrong man to target. Sullivan's attorney stood abruptly, pointing a shaking finger at Elijah. This is a witch hunt. Judge Monroe is grandstanding. This is an attempt to undermine our officers. Elijah turned, unbothered, and spoke to the crowd instead. Undermine or expose. Because the truth is simple. Officer Sullivan believed he was untouchable. He believed he could stop me, humiliate me, and no one would care. And I'm standing here today because that belief is built on a system that protects people like him at the expense of everyone else. Chief Perkins tried to interject, his voice frail against the rising storm. Judge Monroe, please. Elijah raised his voice, his tone carrying over Perkins' weak protest. This is not just about one man. It's about the culture that allows this to happen. It's about how silence lets corruption thrive. He turned back to Sullivan, who now looked small despite the uniform. And I won't be silent anymore. The crowd erupted. Shouts of agreement mixed with applause, while others called for accountability. Reporters leaned forward, their cameras fixed on Sullivan as he looked to Chief Perkins, searching for support that wasn't there. The chief's face was pale, his composure crumbling under the weight of the moment. Mitchell moved beside Elijah, speaking quietly. That was one hell of a move, Elijah. Elijah didn't smile. His gaze remained steady as he looked out at the crowd, at the faces of people who had been ignored for far too long. It's not over yet, he said softly. But we've made them listen. Later that night, as Elijah stepped into the cool darkness outside, the crowd from the meeting had spilled into the streets. They weren't leaving. They were gathering. Signs were raised high, chants rippling through the air. No justice, no peace. Elijah watched for a moment, feeling the energy in the crowd like a fire. Then he heard Mitchell's voice behind him. You forced their hand, Elijah. This doesn't end here. You know that, right? I do, Elijah replied, his voice calm but resolute. But this is a beginning. Mitchell frowned. And Sullivan? What happens to him? Elijah's gaze lingered on the crowd. That's up to the system now, but this time, we're watching. The sound of the chants carried into the night, the movement growing, spreading. The confrontation was over, but the fight had just begun. And as Elijah stood on the steps, silhouetted against the rising voices of a town that had finally been awakened, he knew one thing. The silence had been broken, and there was no going back. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden glow over the quiet streets of Clarksfield. The echoes of the night's chants still seemed to hum faintly in the air as Elijah Monroe stood on the steps of the courthouse. The crowd had dispersed hours ago, but the energy remained, like embers smoldering, waiting to ignite once again. Beside him, Mitchell handed over a steaming cup of coffee. They're not going to forget last night anytime soon. They shouldn't, Elijah replied, his voice calm but heavy with exhaustion. He took a sip, letting the warmth settle him. Not this time. Mitchell nodded, surveying the quiet streets. Word's spreading fast. Sullivan's suspension is already making headlines. The mayor's office just announced an independent investigation into the department, and the state attorney general is involved now. Elijah's jaw tightened slightly, but his eyes didn't waver. It's a start. That's more than a start, Mitchell said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. This wouldn't have happened if you hadn't pushed. Elijah turned to face him. If we hadn't pushed, he corrected. This isn't about me. This is about everyone who came forward, everyone who refused to let it go. The news of Officer Sullivan's suspension sent ripples through Clarksfield. For the first time in years, people began to believe that the system, long seen as an unshakable wall, was showing cracks. Local media outlets ran stories of the growing investigation with headlines like, Clarksfield Police Under Fire for Systemic Misconduct. But it wasn't just the news that had shifted. The community had changed too. On the courthouse lawn, clusters of protesters lingered. Among them were familiar faces, Young men who had been targeted by Sullivan, parents who'd watched their children humiliated, and small business owners tired of being ignored. Their signs read, "Justice for all," and "We will not be silent." For Elijah, those faces were the real victory. 3 days later, Elijah sat in his chambers, sorting through a growing pile of letters and emails. Some were supportive, thanking him for standing up, for breaking the silence. Others were hateful, filled with venomous accusations and thinly veiled threats. He kept those in a separate folder. He didn't need the reminders, but he refused to look away from the reality of what he had taken on. "Busy?" Elijah looked up to see Janine peeking through the door, a soft smile on her face. "Come in," he said, leaning back in his chair. She stepped inside, holding a thick envelope. "This just came in, thought you'd want to see it." "What is it?" "An official statement from the police department, Sullivan's resignation." Elijah paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "Resignation?" Janine nodded. "Looks like he didn't want to wait for the investigation to run its course. The pressure got to him. They say it's voluntary, but no one's buying that." Elijah let out a slow breath, his mind racing through the implications. Sullivan may have escaped formal consequences for now, but his career was over. He was exposed. The system that protected him for so long had finally cracked under the weight of truth. "Good," Elijah murmured. "One less man who thinks he's above the law." Janine hesitated, then asked softly, "Does it feel like a win?" Elijah considered her question for a moment before answering. "It feels like a beginning." In the weeks that followed, the town of Clarksfield began to shift in ways both big and small. The independent investigation uncovered years of buried complaints, patterns of bias, and records that had been conveniently ignored. Sullivan was just the beginning. Other officers were suspended or placed under review. Chief Perkins announced his retirement, for health reasons, though everyone knew it wasn't voluntary. Community meetings turned from tense standoffs into real discussions. The voices that had been silenced for so long were now at the forefront, demanding change, and being heard. New oversight committees were formed, led by a mix of community leaders and legal professionals, to hold the police department accountable. Elijah watched it all unfold, both as a participant and an observer. He attended meetings, listened to concerns, and offered his voice where it was needed. But he also knew when to step back, letting others carry the torch. This wasn't about him. It was bigger than that. One evening, he found himself at a small cafe, meeting with the young man who had testified at the forum. The boy, David, looked nervous but determined. "I wanted to say thank you," David said, fiddling with the rim of his coffee cup. "For everything I didn't think anyone would listen to us." "They were always listening," Elijah replied gently. "They just didn't want to hear you. That's what needed to change." David nodded, his gaze steady. "I've been thinking about going into law school. I want to help people the way you did." Elijah felt a rare smile tug at his lips. "Then you should. The world needs more voices like yours." Despite the progress, Elijah knew the fight wasn't over. There were still pockets of resistance, people who dismissed the movement as a witch hunt, officers who grumbled about being unfairly scrutinized. Even some members of the judiciary avoided him now, unwilling to accept the truth he'd forced them to see. One morning, Mitchell found him in his office, sifting through court case records. "Working again? I thought you'd take a break after all this." Elijah didn't look up. "No breaks, Mitchell. There's too much to do." Mitchell leaned against the doorframe, studying him. "You've changed. You know you're different." Elijah paused, finally looking up. "How so?" "You've always believed in the law, Elijah, but now you're willing to fight for it in a way you didn't before. You're not just upholding the system, you're challenging it." Elijah's expression softened. "Because the system isn't perfect, Mitchell. And pretending it is doesn't fix anything. Mitchell grinned faintly. And here I thought you were just a quiet judge with no appetite for trouble. Trouble finds you when you're doing the right thing, Elijah said simply. Months later, Clarksfield was no longer the same town. The investigation into the police department led to new policies, new leadership, and a renewed focus on accountability. Officers who remained underwent rigorous retraining, with input from community leaders and advocates. Trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight. But the first stones had been laid. Elijah stood on the courthouse steps once again, this time overlooking a peaceful crowd. People were talking, shaking hands and offering quiet smiles of relief. The fight wasn't over, but hope had returned. Janine approached, a soft smile on her face. They're waiting for you to say something. Elijah exhaled, looking out at the people who had made this moment possible. He stepped forward, raising his voice so everyone could hear. This town has seen its darkest truths laid bare, Elijah began. But it's also seen something far more powerful. What happens when people refuse to stay silent? What happens when we demand accountability, justice, and change? This is just the beginning, but it's proof of what we can accomplish when we stand together. The crowd applauded, their cheers echoing across the streets. Elijah stepped back, his heart full but his resolve stronger than ever. As he turned to walk back inside, Mitchell joined him. What now, Judge Monroe? Elijah smiled faintly, the weight of the months easing from his shoulders. Now we keep going, one case, one fight, one truth at a time. The story didn't end here. Change never did. But for Clarksfield, and for Elijah Monroe, it was the start of a new chapter. A chapter of hope, resilience, and the unwavering belief that justice, no matter how hard won, was worth fighting for. Months had passed since Elijah Monroe stood on the courthouse steps and spoke to a town ready to listen. The echoes of that moment rippled outward, reaching far beyond Clarksfield. For Elijah, the storm that had begun with a single traffic stop had forced him to look deeper, not only at the system he had devoted his life to, but at himself. He sat now in his chambers, the familiar quiet surrounding him. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting soft light on the wooden shelves lined with law books and framed photos. The space, which once felt like a sanctuary, now carried a new weight. He leaned back in his chair, looking over the documents on his desk. Updates on the police department's reforms, a report on the Oversight Committee's progress, and letters from young law students who'd found inspiration in his story. He picked up one of those letters, his fingers brushing over the paper. Dear Judge Monroe, it began. Your courage gave me hope I've always dreamed of practicing law, but I didn't think someone like me could make a difference. Watching you stand up for justice taught me that one person's voice can change the world. Thank you for reminding me that the law belongs to all of us. Elijah set the letter down, his chest tightening. For years, he had believed the system could heal itself, that with enough patience and diligence, justice would prevail. But his experience with Officer Sullivan had been a painful revelation. The system wasn't infallible, it was flawed, vulnerable to the same prejudices and corruption that plagued society, and those flaws would remain, unless someone challenged them. For Elijah, that challenge had been the turning point. The events of the past months had tested him in ways he never expected. Elijah Monroe, the quiet judge who once preferred to let his decisions speak for themselves, had become a symbol of accountability. But it hadn't come easily. He had faced scrutiny, resistance, and even threats. Some of his peers whispered that he'd gone too far, while others avoided him entirely. Yet Elijah had changed. He was no longer content to uphold the system from behind the safety of his bench. He understood now that real change required stepping into the fire, risking comfort, reputation, and safety. His ordeal had also forced him to confront the anger he'd buried for years, the frustration of being seen as less than, despite his achievements. The quiet humiliations endured in boardrooms, hallways, and streets. But instead of letting that anger consume him, Elijah had turned it into something stronger: resolve. He no longer doubted his purpose. Clarksfield had become a microcosm for something far larger than itself. The exposure of Officer Sullivan and the systemic failures that protected him ignited conversations across the state. News outlets highlighted other towns grappling with similar patterns of discrimination, forcing police departments and local governments to take a hard look at their practices. Reforms in Clarksfield became a model for others: independent oversight committees, mandatory bias training for officers, and policies emphasizing de-escalation and accountability. Critics called it a band-aid, but Elijah knew better. Change didn't happen all at once. It started small and grew stronger when people refused to turn back. More importantly, the people of Clarksfield changed. Those who had once suffered in silence found their voices. Small business owners who had been targeted spoke up. Young men like David found the courage to demand better, and families came together to hold their leaders accountable. The protests hadn't just been noise, they'd been a reckoning, a call to action that refused to fade. One evening, Elijah stood at a local community center, addressing a room full of law students and young activists. Their faces were alight with determination, eager to listen and learn. "The law isn't perfect," Elijah began, his voice calm but commanding. "It's a reflection of the people who enforce it, uphold it, and challenge it. If we want justice to be real, we have to be willing to fight for it, not just in the courtrooms, but in our communities, our classrooms, and our hearts." A young woman raised her hand. "How do you keep going, Judge Monroe, when it feels like the system is too broken to fix?" Elijah smiled faintly. "You remember that progress is possible, even when it's slow. Change doesn't happen because of one person or one moment. It happens when we refuse to give up, when we refuse to stay silent. Every step forward matters, no matter how small." Another voice chimed in. "What about the people who resist, who refuse to change?" Elijah's expression turned somber. "There will always be resistance to progress. Fear makes people cling to the familiar, even when it's broken, but that doesn't mean we stop. Sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones most worth fighting." As he looked out at the crowd, he saw reflections of himself in their eyes: doubt, hope, anger, and an unshakable desire to make a difference. The next generation was ready to pick up the torch. Weeks turned into months, and the storm of attention eventually began to fade. But the changes in Clarksfield remained. New leaders emerged, reforms took hold, and Elijah Monroe's name became synonymous with the fight for accountability. For Elijah, the work didn't stop. He returned to his bench with a sharper sense of purpose, taking every case as an opportunity to ensure justice wasn't just a word, but a promise. He spoke at schools, mentored young lawyers, and lent his voice to initiatives aimed at reforming broken systems. One afternoon, as he sat in his chambers, he received a visit from David, the young man who had once testified at the public forum. "I got in," David said, holding up a letter. "Law school." Elijah's face broke into a smile. "Congratulations, David. You earned it." David hesitated before speaking again. "I just want to make sure I do it right. I want to fight for people who don't have a voice." "You will," Elijah replied firmly. "Just remember, justice isn't about winning. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard." David nodded, his confidence growing. "Thank you, Judge Monroe, for everything." As David left, Elijah sat back in his chair, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. The fight wasn't over. It would never truly be over. But moments like these reminded him why he kept going. Elijah's story wasn't just his own. It belonged to everyone who had ever been underestimated, silenced, or ignored. It was a reminder of the power of resilience, and the importance of standing firm, even when the odds felt insurmountable. His fight exposed a truth that many already knew, but too few acknowledged. The system wasn't broken by accident. It was upheld by silence, complacency, and fear. And breaking that silence, challenging the comfortable, is what made change possible. To anyone listening, Elijah's story carried a clear message. Stand up, speak out. Refuse to accept the unacceptable. On a quiet evening, Elijah walked through his neighborhood, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. The air was calm, but he knew the storm would come again. There would be more fights, more challenges, and more people like Officer Sullivan, who clung to power they didn't deserve. But Elijah wasn't afraid. He had seen firsthand what happened when people stood together, when voices rose in unison to demand something better. As he turned the corner, he spotted David and a group of young activists gathered under a street lamp, talking, planning, ready to take on the next battle. Elijah smiled softly, his heart full. This was the beginning of something greater, and as long as he could stand, Elijah Monroe would be ready to fight. The story of Elijah Monroe isn't just a story of one man. It's a story of courage, justice, and the belief that progress is worth the struggle. It's a call to all of us to challenge the systems we inherit and to demand a world where dignity and fairness are not privileges, but guarantees. Because change doesn't happen by waiting. It happens when we refuse to look away. And it begins with us.